The old garage at the end of the block had always been an eyesore. Rusted doors, broken windows, and thick vines creeping up the faded brick walls, it looked like a place that had long been forgotten. No one in the neighborhood paid much attention to it. Until one day, something strange started happening. Every evening, just as the sun dipped below the rooftops, a sleek black car would pull up to the abandoned lot. And stepping out of that car, a man who looked like he had no business being there. He was tall, well-dressed, and carried himself with the kind of confidence that made people take a second look. The expensive suit, the polished shoes, the quiet but powerful presence, everything about him screamed wealth. And yet, night after night, he would slip into that broken-down garage, disappearing into the shadows without a word. For weeks, the neighbors whispered about it, trading theories over fences and in grocery store aisles. Was he hiding something? Was this some secret deal going down in the dead of night? But it wasn't just the man that raised eyebrows. What really got people talking was the girl. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, with deep brown skin that glowed under the streetlights. She always arrived first, walking briskly toward the garage, glancing over her shoulder as if checking to make sure no one was watching. And then, the millionaire would follow. It was Mrs. Thompson, the elderly woman who lived across the street, who noticed first. She'd sit by her window every evening, sipping tea, watching the world go by. But now, she had a mystery on her hands. She saw the girl, saw the man, saw the way they moved, like they were keeping a secret too big to share. Then, one night, curiosity got the best of her. She grabbed her coat, stepped onto her porch, and slowly crossed the street, her heart pounding in her chest. As she crept closer, she could hear voices. Low, serious whispers. Then a sudden laugh, light, soft, full of something she couldn't quite place. Mrs. Thompson hesitated, debating whether to go further, whether to finally see for herself what was happening inside that old, forgotten place. But before she could take another step, the garage door creaked open just a sliver. And what she saw inside left her breathless. She had expected something dark, something dangerous. But instead, she saw something she never could have imagined. And in that moment, she realized, the truth was far more shocking than any rumor the neighborhood had spun. Mrs. Thompson's breath hitched as she peered through the narrow opening of the garage door. The dim glow of a single light bulb flickered inside, casting long shadows against the cracked concrete walls. At first, her eyes struggled to adjust to the darkness, but then, she saw them. The young woman stood near the center of the garage, her arms crossed, listening intently as the man in the expensive suit spoke in a low, serious tone. His face was partially obscured by the shadows, but there was something unmistakably intense about his expression. Mrs. Thompson could feel the weight of the moment, but she had no idea what it meant. Who was this girl? And why was she here, night after night, with a man who clearly didn't belong in a place like this? Every instinct in her body told her to step back, to mind her business, but she couldn't pull herself away. Then, the girl laughed again. It was soft, almost nervous, but there was warmth in it. The man let out a deep sigh and ran a hand through his neatly trimmed hair. His whole demeanor shifted, like he was carrying something heavy on his shoulders. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, holding it out to her. Mrs. Thompson squinted, trying to make sense of it. Was it money? A key? Something more dangerous? But before she could get a better look, the girl shook her head and took a step back. I told you, the girl's voice came, firm but quiet. I don't want this to be about that. The man hesitated, then nodded, slipping the object back into his pocket. I know, he said. But you have to let me help you. Mrs. Thompson's fingers tightened around the edge of the garage door. Whatever was happening inside wasn't what she had expected. There was no argument, no threats, no signs of anything illegal. But there was something else, something deeper, something unspoken. The girl turned away, pacing toward a corner of the garage where an old wooden crate sat covered in dust. She ran her fingers along its surface before taking a deep breath. "I didn't bring you here to fix things," she said finally. "I just needed you to understand." The man's face softened, his posture shifting slightly. "I do understand," he murmured. "More than you think." Silence settled between them, thick and heavy. Mrs. Thompson's mind raced with possibilities. Was this some secret relationship? A hidden past they shared? Or something even more complicated? Then, the girl did something unexpected. She reached down and lifted the lid of the crate, revealing a pile of old, faded papers inside. Carefully, she picked up one of the pages and handed it to the man. He took it, his brow furrowing as he read. Whatever was written there, it had an effect on him. His jaw tightened, his fingers gripping the paper a little too hard. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The girl hesitated before answering. "It was my mother's," she said. "She hid it here years ago." Mrs. Thompson felt her heart skip a beat. A mother's secret? Hidden away in an abandoned garage? The pieces of the mystery were coming together, but they still didn't form a clear picture. The man exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "I should have known," he muttered. "She always said there were things I didn't understand." For the first time, Mrs. Thompson noticed something different in his tone, something almost personal. Whoever this man was, he wasn't just some rich stranger with a passing interest in the girl. There was history here. Deep, tangled history. The girl watched him closely, as if waiting for him to process whatever realization had just hit him. "You knew her, didn't you?" she asked softly. The man hesitated, then nodded. "A long time ago." The girl swallowed hard. "And you never told me?" His eyes met hers, filled with something Mrs. Thompson couldn't quite name. Regret? Pain? Guilt? "I didn't know you existed," he admitted. The girl's breath caught, her body going still. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, she looked down at the crate, as if seeing it differently now. "Then maybe," she whispered, "it's time for you to know everything." Mrs. Thompson's pulse raced. She had stayed too long, seen too much. And yet, she couldn't tear herself away. Because whatever truth was about to be revealed, it was going to change everything. The silence inside the garage stretched long and heavy. The girl stood still, her fingers gripping the edges of the crate as if grounding herself. The man, this mysterious, wealthy man who had been showing up here night after night, stared down at the paper in his hands. His expression was unreadable, but something in his posture had changed. He wasn't just a visitor anymore. He was part of this, tied to whatever secret had been buried inside this forgotten place. Mrs. Thompson's heart pounded in her chest as she remained frozen outside, hidden in the shadows. She had stumbled upon something far bigger than she had expected, and now, she couldn't walk away. Not yet. The girl inhaled sharply, as if bracing herself. "She never talked about her past," she said, her voice quieter now. "Not really. Just little pieces here and there. But she was always afraid of something. I never knew what." The man's jaw tightened. He folded the paper carefully, slipping it into his coat pocket like it was something precious. "Your mother was smart to hide this," he murmured. If the wrong people had found it, he let the sentence trail off, his gaze flickering toward the dark corners of the garage. The girl stiffened. "What do you mean? Who would care about some old letters and papers?" The man sighed, rubbing a hand across his face. "It's not just paper. It's proof." The girl frowned. "Proof of what?" He hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "Your mother and I, we knew each other a long time ago. Before I became the man I am now." His voice was laced with something unspoken, something deep. "And before she disappeared." The girl's breath hitched. She didn't disappear. She died. The man shook his head. That's what they told you. A chill ran down Mrs. Thompson's spine. She wasn't sure what she had expected when she started watching, but it hadn't been this. The girl's mother, gone, but not in the way she had believed. What had really happened? And why was this man so invested in the truth? The girl took a step back, her hands trembling slightly. You're lying. I wish I was, the man said softly. But your mother was in danger. And if she knew to hide these letters, then that danger didn't die with her. The girl's face paled. What are you saying? The man exhaled slowly. I'm saying that if we found this, if we put the pieces together, then someone else might be looking too. And they won't stop until they find what they're after. A sudden noise outside made them both turn sharply. Mrs. Thompson flinched, pressing herself against the cold brick wall. For a brief moment, she feared they had seen her. But then the girl moved toward the garage door, peering out cautiously. It's probably nothing, she muttered, though her voice wavered slightly. The man didn't look convinced. He reached into his coat again, this time pulling out something else, something small and metallic that glinted under the dim light. A key. He held it out to the girl. If anything happens, he said, you take this and go to the address written inside. Don't ask questions. Just go. The girl stared at the key, then back at him. Why would I trust you? The man's lips pressed into a thin line. Because I promised your mother I'd protect you. The girl's hands curled into fists. And where were you all these years? The man flinched, just slightly, but enough for Mrs. Thompson to notice. Whatever guilt he carried, it was real. I wasn't there, he admitted. But I'm here now. And if we don't figure this out soon, we might not get another chance. The tension in the air was almost suffocating. Mrs. Thompson's mind raced with questions. Who was this man to the girl's mother? What had she been hiding? And what danger still lurked in the shadows after all this time? The girl finally took the key, gripping it tightly. But her expression was wary, guarded. If I do this, she said slowly, I'm doing it my way. The man gave a small nod. Fair enough. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, the girl turned back toward the crate, pulling out another letter, scanning the faded ink like she was trying to piece together something long buried. The man watched her closely, his expression unreadable. Outside, Mrs. Thompson took a shaky breath. She had heard enough. More than enough. She had only meant to satisfy her curiosity, but now, she was tangled in something far bigger. And as she turned to slip away, one thought lingered in her mind. If the past was still haunting this girl, then maybe it wasn't done with this town either. As Mrs. Thompson made her way back to her house, her mind spun with everything she had just overheard. With a sudden burst of determination, Mrs. Thompson grabbed her coat and stepped outside. She made her way toward the garage again, each step carrying her deeper into the unknown. Her pulse quickened with every inch of ground she covered. What if she was wrong? What if she wasn't supposed to know? But the feeling in her gut told her that there was no turning back now. As she reached the corner of the street, she saw the man's car parked in front of the garage, the engine running. He was waiting for something, or someone. She quickly ducked behind a nearby bush, heart hammering in her chest. She could see through the crack in the garage door, just enough to catch a glimpse of the girl, still standing at the crate, still holding the letter. The tension was unbearable. Mrs. Thompson barely dared to breathe. She couldn't make out the words, but she could see the way the girl's face twisted with uncertainty, as if she were trying to decide whether to follow through with something. The man's voice came low and firm. You need to go now. Before it's too late. The girl hesitated, her fingers tightening around the letter. But what if I'm not ready? What if I can't handle what comes next? You don't have a choice, the man replied, his tone hard. You need to act, and you need to act fast. They're already on to us. They're always watching. At that, Mrs. Thompson's heart skipped a beat. Who were they? Who was watching them, and why? The more she heard, the more questions piled up. It was clear now that whatever this man had been hiding, whatever the girl's mother had left behind, it wasn't just about old letters or forgotten truths. This was dangerous. The girl took a deep breath and nodded, as though steeling herself for something inevitable. All right. I'll go. Without another word, she turned toward the door of the garage, the key still clutched tightly in her hand. Mrs. Thompson's breath caught in her throat as she watched the girl step into the night, disappearing into the darkness. The man lingered in the doorway, watching her go, his expression unreadable. Then, he glanced over his shoulder, and for the briefest moment, his eyes met Mrs. Thompson's through the crack in the door. His gaze was sharp, knowing, as if he had sensed her presence all along. Mrs. Thompson's stomach churned. She had been seen. Before she could retreat, before she could even process what had just happened, the man stepped forward, closing the door with a heavy thud. The sound echoed through the empty street, reverberating in Mrs. Thompson's ears as she stood frozen in place. Inside the garage, she could hear muffled voices, but they were too distant for her to make out. She couldn't see what was happening, but she knew that the moment she had been waiting for was about to unfold. The girl was on her way to uncover the truth. The man, despite his reluctance, had given her the key to something far more dangerous than she realized. And somewhere in the shadows, something, was waiting for them both. Mrs. Thompson could feel it in her bones. The storm was coming. And when it hit, everything would change. The garage door creaked open slowly, its rusty hinges groaning in protest as if reluctant to reveal the secrets within. Mrs. Thompson, still crouched behind the bush, could barely breathe. She had waited for this moment, watched the girl and the man disappear inside, but now she was caught in the heart of it all. The tension in the air felt almost suffocating as she peered through the small gap, hoping for a glimpse of the truth. What had the girl found? What was this key that held so much power? Inside, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. The man stood near the back of the garage, his eyes darting nervously toward the girl. Her hands were trembling as she approached a rusted filing cabinet tucked into the corner. She was breathing heavily, the weight of everything pressing down on her. The letter she had found, the key, it was all leading to this moment. She slid the key into the lock, her breath catching as the metal clicked open. Slowly, she pulled the drawer out, revealing a stack of old, weathered documents. The man stepped forward, his eyes locking on the papers with an intensity that sent a chill down Mrs. Thompson's spine. This was it, the moment they had been preparing for. You don't have to do this, the man said quietly, his voice strained. You don't know what you're getting into. The girl didn't reply. She reached for the top document and pulled it free. As her eyes scanned the words, her face paled. This is about my mother, isn't it? The man's lips pressed into a tight line. He didn't answer at first, just stood there, his body tense. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and heavy with regret. Your mother was trying to protect you. She knew what was coming, and she knew the only way to keep you safe was to hide the truth. The girl looked up, her expression full of disbelief. What truth? Before he could answer, a loud crash echoed from outside the garage. The door rattled violently, and Mrs. Thompson felt her heart leap in her chest. The sound wasn't from the street. It was coming from the back of the garage, something heavy had struck the wall. The girl whipped around, her eyes wide with panic. They found us. The man cursed under his breath and quickly moved to the back of the garage, his movements swift and calculated. We don't have much time. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, black device, a signal jammer. We can't let them trace us. The girl dropped the papers, her hands shaking. Who are they? What's going on? Why is everything so secretive? Before the man could respond, another crash, this time louder, came from the side of the garage. Mrs. Thompson, still watching from her hidden spot, couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in her stomach. Whatever was happening in that garage, it was more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The girl's mother had clearly known something that had put them all in danger. Suddenly, the garage door slammed open with force, nearly flying off its hinges. Two men in black suits rushed inside, their expressions cold and determined. They were tall, their movements synchronized as they moved toward the girl and the man. One of them spoke in a low, threatening tone. "We've been looking for that. Hand it over." The girl stepped back, her eyes darting between the man and the intruders. "What do you want?" The man moved quickly, shielding her from their view. "Get out of here, now," he ordered, his voice sharp with authority. "Go to the address on the letter. Don't look back." The girl hesitated, but the man's urgency made her step toward the door. Just as she reached for the handle, one of the suited men grabbed her arm, pulling her back toward him. "You're not going anywhere." In the chaos, Mrs. Thompson's heart pounded. She couldn't stay hidden much longer. She had to do something, anything to help. Without thinking, she took a deep breath, stepped from her hiding spot, and rushed toward the door. "Leave her alone," she shouted, her voice shaking. The men turned toward her in surprise. The girl's eyes widened as she saw Mrs. Thompson standing at the entrance, her face a mixture of fear and determination. The suited man holding the girl's arm released it and turned to Mrs. Thompson. "What do you think you're doing?" he asked, his voice laced with menace. Mrs. Thompson's mind raced, but her legs carried her forward without hesitation. "I don't know what's going on, but I won't let you hurt her. Not while I'm here." For a moment, the room was still, the tension thick enough to suffocate. The man in the suit looked at her for a long moment, his gaze calculating. Then, to Mrs. Thompson's shock, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Let her go," he ordered, his voice softening just slightly. The girl stood there, wide-eyed, unsure of what had just happened. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Who are you?" The suited man's gaze flickered to the other intruder, who gave a small, curt nod. The first man sighed, lowering his hands. "I'm not your enemy," he said quietly. "Your mother made sure of that." Mrs. Thompson's breath caught. "What do you mean?" The man stepped closer, and for the first time, his cold exterior seemed to crack. "Your mother wasn't just trying to protect her daughter. She was trying to protect everyone from something much bigger. Something that could change everything." The final twist came when the girl turned to Mrs. Thompson, a look of dawning realization on her face. "My mother wasn't just a victim of something dark. She was part of it. She knew what was coming. And so do I now." As the girl stepped into the unknown, the garage door slammed shut, and the sound of distant footsteps echoed through the empty streets. The storm had come, and it wasn't over. The game had changed, and the pieces were finally falling into place. The garage door fell silent, leaving only the sound of hurried breaths in the dimly lit room. Mrs. Thompson felt a strange sense of urgency mixed with relief, but there was still a deep ache in her chest, a feeling that something was about to change, and there was no turning back. The suited man turned away from the girl, his eyes now focused solely on Mrs. Thompson. There was no malice in his gaze, just a quiet understanding, as if he had been expecting her. "You don't need to know everything right now," he said softly. "But you should understand that the world you know is only a small part of what's really out." The girl, still standing near the door, looked back at Mrs. Thompson, her eyes filled with questions. "Why are you helping us?" she asked, her voice unsteady. "What does all of this have to do with my mother? And why did she leave me all these clues?" The man sighed deeply, stepping back into the shadows of the garage. Your mother was part of something much bigger than any of us. She tried to shield you from the truth, but it wasn't just about keeping you safe. It was about protecting the world from the darkness that's always been lurking. She knew that one day you'd find out, and she was preparing you for it. Mrs. Thompson shook her head, trying to process what he was saying. What are you talking about? What darkness? Her voice was almost frantic now, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on her chest. The man looked directly at her. I'm not talking about the kind of darkness you're used to, crime, corruption, greed. No. This is something deeper. Something far more dangerous. Your mother wasn't just hiding information, she was hiding power. A power that could change the course of everything. The girl stepped closer to Mrs. Thompson, her face a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. Power? What kind of power? He hesitated, then nodded slowly. The kind that could bring both hope and destruction. Your mother was part of a group that was entrusted with keeping this power safe. But it wasn't just about protecting it. It was about ensuring it didn't fall into the wrong hands. Mrs. Thompson felt a cold chill run down her spine as she began to understand the magnitude of what was being said. And the people who are after you, they want this power, she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The man nodded grimly. Yes. They want to control it. They believe it will make them invincible. The girl clenched her fists, her expression hardening. But my mother hid it. She made sure I didn't know about any of this. She had to, the man said softly. She knew that when the time came, you would have to decide whether to protect this power or destroy it. It's never been about good or evil, it's about balance. And if the wrong person finds it, the world could be lost. The girl turned away from the man, her thoughts clearly swirling. Mrs. Thompson could see the weight of her mother's legacy settling heavily on her shoulders. There was a moment of silence, one that felt as if the entire world was holding its breath. Finally, the girl spoke, her voice steady but filled with resolve. I'm not going to let them have it. I'm not going to let the world fall into their hands. She turned to Mrs. Thompson, her gaze intense. I have to finish what my mother started. I have to protect it. Mrs. Thompson nodded slowly, the enormity of the decision sinking in. This was bigger than anything she had ever imagined. And yet, standing here with the girl, she knew this was the moment of truth. It wasn't just about uncovering a hidden past anymore, it was about shaping the future. The weight of that responsibility was almost overwhelming, but it was a responsibility the girl was ready to take on. The man gave a final, approving nod before turning to the door. Then it's time. The people who have been looking for you won't stop. We have to move quickly. As the girl stepped forward, Mrs. Thompson followed, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure, this was only the beginning. Whatever darkness lay ahead, it was up to them to stop it. Together, they walked out of the garage and into the unknown. The streets were empty, the town eerily quiet, but the air was thick with anticipation. Mrs. Thompson looked at the girl, who now carried the weight of her mother's secrets, and the fate of the world, in her hands. She knew this wasn't just about protecting power. It was about ensuring that power didn't corrupt, didn't destroy. The last thing Mrs. Thompson saw before the door to the garage swung shut behind them was the look on the girl's face, resolute, determined, but still unsure of what was to come. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with danger and impossible choices. But one thing was clear, the girl was ready. And as they disappeared into the night, Mrs. Thompson couldn't help but feel that the story wasn't over, not by a long shot. Whatever was waiting in the shadows, they would face it together. And maybe, just maybe, the world had a chance after all. But that would be a story for another time.